Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and today I want to talk about how to make this rolling ball animation, which kind of seems like it's obvious. You just take a sphere, you animate the location with keyframes, animate the rotation, but you're going to notice that this rotation actually makes physical sense, like the rotation follows the direction of the path, and that's kind of not an obvious thing to do. So today we're going to be talking about how to make this using an arbitrary path. So you can see I actually have this defined as a curve, and we're also going to talk a bit about the shading. So you see that this actually has some stripes on it, so we can actually tell the orientation of the sphere, which matters if this thing is rotating. So we're going to be using curves. We're going to be using the graph editor, which is probably not something used quite too often. And yeah, I guess now you're excited. So let's get started. I'm going to start off with a brand new scene. Assuming you haven't messed with your Blender, this is what your default scene looks like as well. So once you're here, we're going to delete the cube. We're going to add in a sphere. Now, technically, this technique works with any object, but since we're talking about a rolling thing, you probably want the sphere since it can change direction, or you could do a cylinder, but it's not going to be able to change directions in every way because it's not symmetric. But whatever. You have a sphere. We're going to do shade smooth. Fine. You can also subdivide it a bit more if you care. I don't. And the first thing we want to do is specify the path that it's going down. So what we don't want to do is add a keyframe here, go to a different frame, animate, keyframe, and then play that. We don't want that. We want a fully procedural approach. That gives us a lot more control and that we can edit much faster. So what we're going to do is we're going to Shift A to add a curve, and you can pick any of these curves. This is just us defining a path, but if you want one that isn't already like pre-made, I recommend you do a Bezier, which is a nice word, and you can see it over here. It starts off very small. I don't know why it spawns in so small, but you can take this curve, tab for edit mode, and then scale everything up. And you want to do this scaling in edit mode as opposed to object mode. And I don't know if it matters for this, but with other stuff it can cause some glitches if you don't. So make sure you're in edit mode. And if you want to edit the path, you can of course just select a vertex and move it on the X, Y, Z axis, whatever. Or you can hit E to extrude, and that's just going to add more to our path. So I'm just going to, I don't know, put this somewhere here. I don't want to go along the Z axis since I want this all to be coplanar, so it's all on the ground plane. And once you have your path defined, it can be any length, any amount of windiness. We're also going to make it a bit higher resolution because you can see these segments are kind of they have very sharp corners, and we want this to look more like a smooth path. So to fix this, we're going to go to the curve properties. What's this called? Is it called object data? Yeah, object data properties. I call them curve properties. And for the preview, we're going to take our resolution preview and bump that up. And you can see now we have something much smoother. So this is before, and then this is after. Did it not update? Let's try it again. This is after. There we go. Maybe that's a bug. Okay, cool. So now we have our path defined, and we're back in object mode. And to have our sphere go along it, what we're going to do is we're going to select our sphere. And then you might think that you need a modifier for this, but it's not a modifier. It's actually a constraint because we're constraining it in terms of location and orientation. So go to constraints over here, and then go to follow path because we're going to have this sphere follow a path. So for our target being what path do we want, we're just going to choose our Bezier curve because we didn't rename it. And it's going to start off at one endpoint. This can be thought of as either the start or the end depending on your perspective. And to animate this going along the path, you're going to look at this offset. And the first thing you're going to try is making it positive, and it doesn't do anything. So your next step is to make it negative, and you see that it's actually sweeping across it in a linear fashion, meaning that when we're at 0, it's on one end. When we're at negative 100, as in 100%, negative 100, it's at the other. And if we go to something like a negative 50, it should be halfway in between in terms of length. So this windiness section is just as long as that section. So that is the halfway point, which means we can go to 0, add a keyframe by hovering over, hitting I, or you could just right click and add a keyframe that way. But we have a keyframe, go to frame, let's limit this to 100. So on frame 100, I'm going to have it go to, again, negative 100. You can think of this as 100% completion of the path. Add another keyframe, and when we play this, you see it's sweeping along, but if you're looking carefully, the interpolation is a bit weird. right? It starts off at 0 velocity and speeds up. It accelerates, hits max velocity over here, and then slows down. And that's because the interpolation is set to Bezier as well, I think. Yeah, this interpolation. So we can change interpolation by either I think there's a menu inside Graph Editor to do it, but what I recommend is the hotkey is T. So T as in tiger. I don't know. Hit T. Change the keyframe interpolation to linear. That way, it's going to be at constant velocity. Or I guess velocity is changing because direction is changing, but constant speed is probably a physicist will correct me if that's an issue. Okay, cool. So now the next issue, now that we have this going along our path, is the orientation. We want it to roll and to actually make sense. But even if we do that kind of stuff, you're not going to see it because it's a sphere and it kind of looks the same everywhere. So the step we need to do before that is actually give this a bit of shading so we can actually tell which side is up, etc. So once you have your sphere selected, we're going to go to shading, and then we're going to create a new material, and you have a bunch of options for this. You can either add an image texture or use a procedural one. I'm going to be using a procedural one, and we can keep this BSDF and just, tag along anything. You could do something like a noise texture. It really doesn't matter. So here's a noise texture. So this is what this would look like. You can tell this has orientation, right? So if this was rolling, you could tell that this pink splotch would be in one area and not another. So I think for the demo, we did stripes. Let's just do this. It's fine. So noise texture, we want to up the contrast. So I'm just going to add a brightness contrast. And maybe this will make it. There we go. It doesn't look good. Kind of looks like a jawbreaker, actually. It doesn't look good, but it's going to be useful to see if we know what's going on. So back in the layout workspace, we can't see it because we need to be in either look dev or rendered mode. In this case, they're both EV, so it doesn't matter. And you can see that this is kind of just sweeping along without rolling and also without changing orientation. It's not changing which direction it's facing. And the first thing we can do is fix that. So when it's here, we want it to be facing along the path. When it's here, it will be facing that way. When it's here, it will be facing that way, etc. And to do that, all you have to do is hit this very convenient button, which is follow curve. And you can see it says object will follow the heading and banking of the curve, which is exactly what we want. So follow curve, and now you can see it's actually always pointing in the direction of the path. So I want you to notice that where this, hits the path, you have this kind of texture right here, and over here you have the exact same patch of texture. So it's actually moving with it, which means now if we roll it, it's always going to be going in the same direction. So that's the next step. And now the question is, okay, how do you actually animate or keyframe the rolling? Doesn't it change orientation all the time? So when you need to roll on the X and then X and Y at the same time and whatever. Well, the reason that this isn't an issue is because of this follow curve, and our rotation is going to be relative to the object's coordinate system. Okay, what do I mean by this? What I mean is, let's say we animate the X rotation, which right now seems like the right one, right? It'd be rolling in this orientation to go along the path, whereas something like, Y doesn't really make sense for rolling, nor does, I don't know why it keeps going there, or nor does Z. So what we're going to do instead, set this to 0, is we're going to animate this, but just like last time we didn't want to animate location, we don't want to do this manually. So if we did something like keyframe 0, go to frame 100, and then keyframe, I don't know, 2 full revolutions. It's probably not much, but let's do 720, and then add a keyframe, and then, you could also set it to linear and all this. You can see that, the idea is right. I think it's actually going in the wrong orientation, so let's do negative 720, and then keyframe, same idea. So you can see that the idea is right, but it's definitely not rotating enough. It's like moving faster than it's rotating, and even though this is a solution that works, you're going to have to keep changing the number and keep replacing the keyframes, which takes a lot of time. So we want a better option that actually works a lot better for this. So let's delete our keyframes, or clear our keyframes rather. So again, we just have this orientation thing, but not the rotation. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a keyframe just for the first one, for the X rotation in this case, so just click I. But then we're not going to do what we did before. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the graph editor. And you can see right now we have our sphere selected, so we have a bunch of sphere properties. If we deselect it, it's not going to be there. So select the sphere. And inside our object transforms, which is only going to include rotation because that's the only thing that's keyframed, we can select our X rotation since that's what we care about. And then right now it's a flat line because we haven't animated it. It's just at 0. What we can do is hit N to get these to get this panel, right? Same thing up here. You hit N. Here you hit N. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to modifiers and we're going to add in I think there's a couple ways to do this, but the way I like to do it is generator. And basically this is a way to create a polynomial, but if it's a polynomial of order 1, and I'll explain what all this means soon, if it's a polynomial of order 1, this number right here, this 1, is just saying what speed do we want our rotation. So if we hit play, you see it's rotating. It's rotating very fast. So what we can do is make this number smaller, something like 0.1, where 0 is no rotation, so 0.1 is closer to no rotation. So 0.1 is slower, but it's in the wrong direction. It's revolving backwards. So what do? You make it negative, negative 0.1. And now we play it. And you can see this is much faster than keyframing it manually because we can control it just with one number. So now we want the same thing, but maybe rolling a bit faster, maybe twice as fast, so negative 0.2. And then you just kind of want to figure out what number is perfect for this. Of course, there's a mathematically perfect way of doing this, but you could just eyeball it. So negative 0.2 seems pretty correct to me. And the reason this whole polynomial thing is useful is right now we're creating an expression that will dictate what number is sent to this rotation. This polynomial of order 1 is basically just saying over time, this is going to be our slope, negative 0.2, which in this case is correct because of orientation. This is going to have a constant slope. In other words, it's going to have a constant change of rotation, right? So if you look at the graph, which we need to make it a lot bigger to actually see because it's very slanted, this red line is our rotation. And you can see it has a constant slope, which means that over time, this rotation's changing by the same amount, and it's downwards because that's the correct orientation. If we did 0.2, it's going to point upwards by the same magnitude of slope, but in this case, we want downwards. So that's just kind of the theory behind there. But then the question is, okay, so we can edit the speed and the orientation and all this on the fly. Can we also edit the path and everything works? And yes, you can. That's why this is a great technique. So select your curve, edit mode. We could either like extrude to add a bit more to this, or you could, I think, loop cut. I don't really know how this works. Can you like subdivide? Yeah, you can subdivide to add more control points. So I'm just going to take a new control point and move it over here. And remember, we animated the location, not, we didn't like bake it in, but what we said is we baked in progression. So we started at 0 and then went to 100% completion. So no matter what path we do, it's still going to go from the beginning to the end in 100 frames in this case. So you can see the rolling still works and the orientation and everything works. However, of course, if we make this path very long, so by stretching it here, this path has become very long, you're going to notice this rotation. It's still correct, but it's not fast enough, right? Because now this ball is moving much faster, which means it needs a faster rotation to make it look like it makes sense. So how do we fix that? You pick your sphere, negative point, maybe twice as fast, negative 0.4. And now it's looking a bit better, maybe something that might make sense, right? And ideally, again, there's a mathematically perfect way of doing this where this number is dictated by the length of the curve, and I'm sure there's a way to do that once you dive into drivers and all this. But for now, we don't want to worry about that. So let me just do a couple undos. And here's our setup. And then finally, just to make this look okay, you can add in a plane. This is what I had as my demo scene. So I just added in a plane. And then we're just going to want to make this a bit lower. And since the sphere has a radius of 1, which means the whole thing has a diameter, a height of 2, you just bring this down halfway. So G for grab, Z minus 1, I believe. And then that should be exactly correct. Yep. And it's going to look, right, for somebody who doesn't know, it's going to look like it's rolling correctly. Notice how it's turning in a way that makes sense. Of course, the beginning looks a bit awkward, but that's just because our curve is very sharp in the beginning. We need to, yeah, basically this is like unnaturally sharp. The curvature is too much. But in general, the idea is correct there. And the nice thing about this is you can just duplicate the setup, change the curve, and have two balls going, and change the shading to whatever you want. So let me just quickly do that before we end the video. Shading, instead of a noise texture, we could do what I did before, which was a wave texture. And what I like about it is it's pretty simple. It's just stripes going around. And here you can really see the orientation, right? So it's kind of like off kilter. I don't know what the word is, but it's kind of like a I don't know how to explain what I'm even thinking right now. But there you go. You now know how to roll a ball in Blender. Hopefully that was helpful. You learn about constraints, graph editor, polynomials, a bit of shading, stuff like that. And if you enjoyed this free tutorial, the best way to support me is over at my Patreon. Yes, that's right, the end of the video Patreon announcement. Seriously, if you want to help support these tutorials and fund them so I can keep making them in the future, Patreon is the best way to do that, and you also get benefits, including stuff like Discord benefits, private access, tutorial files, and pretty soon for the next CG Matter tutorial I make, you're also going to get access to Patreon exclusive tutorials, which are just going to be like a more in-depth version of what I cover. But generally, it is a donation, but you can also buy benefits, right? So I really appreciate anybody who's willing to do that to help me out. I really appreciate it. And to help yourself out, you get more tutorials. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this free tutorial, and that's it.